But I'm Caleb, and this week we were going to be talking about the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917.
And known as the October Revolution.
Well, we'll be talking about both.
But we're talking November 7th.
Well, it's the October, the Julian and the Gregorian calendar.
In the two calendars.
Right. But not to be distinguished from the February Revolution, which was the overthrow of the Tsar, and the October Revolution was the triumph of the Bolsheviks and the Soviets.
Okay.
But really, before we can talk about that, I mean, the first thing is that the Bolsheviks, what distinguished them and what made them big is, for a long time in the history of Russia, the revolutionary movements had been associated with students only. It wasn't really until Plekhanov started a group called the Emancipation of Labor Group that there was any really attempt to get the masses of workers and peasants, who were the majority of the country, involved. For a long time, the Russian revolutionary movement had been made purely of students. And one of the popular ideas among these student groups, many of which came out of Bakunin, the anarchists' school of thought, was that the way to make revolution was through doing a great act of terror or violence that would inspire everyone, and everyone would see this great act of violence, and then they would rise up. Alexander III, the Tsar, was killed by people throwing bombs at his carriage, and then the idea was that, you know, when he was killed by the bombs, that would inspire people to take up arms, and they would be so happy to see the Tsar being killed that then they would just have no choice but to revolt. And obviously that didn't happen. Lenin's brother was actually involved in the terrorist movement as well, and he did attempt to assassinate, I think it was Tsar Alexander III, before the other terrorists succeeded and got the death penalty. And there was, you know, that was, you know, revolutionary, as Lenin noted in the 1905, in his lecture on the 1905 revolution, was for a long time associated with students. And peasants, when they heard about revolutionaries and people trying to bring down the Tsarist regime, they thought it had nothing to do with them. These are just a bunch of, you know, rich kids in the cities, most of which were children not even of the capitalists, but children of the monarchy, or children of the nobility class, who, you know, thought that that it was time to, they, you know, read enough books and thought it was time to take up arms, but they didn't really believe in the people. They didn't really believe that people were a force in making history. They thought that they would just you know, create some act of violence and the revolution would happen. The most successful, and, you know, that's the most successful, you know, prior to the 1917 revolution, attempt to bring down the Tsar, was actually by the nobles, and it was in the 1850s, and it was called the Decembrist Revolt. And now there's a band, the Decembrists, which is kind of a popular, you know, band, but it was the Decembrist Revolt, and it was the nobles got together, and before Tsar Nicholas I was to be sworn in, they attempted through, you know, kind of a coup d'etat to prevent him from getting crowned, so that then there would be no king, and then they could bring down the monarchy. And of course that failed, and it was a bloodbath in the capital, and that was that. Starting with Plekhanov, who was a leader of the Second International that we discussed last week, of international communists, you know, he started a group called the Emancipation of Labor Group, and that was one of the first groups in the Russian revolutionary movement that made a point of getting involved with the people, and building, you know, ties and coalitions with the people. And Plekhanov's Emancipation of Labor Group started getting involved in the unions, and it was Plekhanov who trained Lenin and taught him about Marxism and all that. And the Emancipation of Labor Group, and then you know, the first, you know, there was the step between the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. They were both joined in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party.
Now, what are we talking at this point? Are we in 1908 yet, or we're talking 1917?
1903.
Okay.
Yeah. And but the minority faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was preaching the same kind of ideas that we talked about last week with Edward Bernstein, the idea that, you know, we just have to fight only for the minimal demands, you know, higher wages. We should try to build an alliance with more liberal capitalists, and we should just gradually, over time, fight for socialism, build socialism one step at a time. And that the party should have a very loose statement of principles. You know, you're for socialism, we're for socialism. You're against the Tsar, we're against the Tsar, and then we all do that, and then eventually, gradually over time, you know, we'll build this progressive majority that will eventually take power and, you know, everything will be nice and, you know, it'll be a fun revolution. Whereas Lenin had come up with his theory of the party of a new type, a highly disciplined party based on democratic centralism, where, you know, there's mass discussion, but then when a decision is made, you follow the decision. Had believed that the state, you know, even if people are guaranteed the right to vote, is still inherently repressive. It's still a machinery of oppression because the capitalists and the wealthy will dominate the state, and that it is necessary to build a new state in the process of revolution. So that was the split, and the Bolshevik Party was the majority faction. That's what Bolshevik actually means in Russian, majority. And then Menshevik means minority. And then in Russia at the time, there was also another group called the Social Revolutionary Party, or the SRs. And they were kind of, they weren't even Marxists. Now, the Mensheviks talked about Marx when they had their reformist ideas. The social revolutionaries, they were just kind of utopian, you know, we need to change the world over time. They were for, you know, kind of a democratic, you know, we want democracy. There were other factions as well. But 1905 was the rehearsal for the Russian Revolution. And what that was in response to was Father Gapon was a priest, a moderate, you know, very moral priest, but in the time of a famine that had struck the entire Russian countryside, Father Gapon got thousands and thousands of peasants to march on the Tsar's palace and peacefully demand bread, food, essentially, for the starving people. And it was a peaceful demonstration of thousands and thousands of people, and it was based on the idea that the Tsar, you know, in the Russian Orthodox Church was like the Pope. I mean, he was the equivalent of the Pope, and the idea was basically we need to appeal to you to let God speak through you and realize that we need food.
I don't think we can appeal to the real Pope these days.
Right. And so, like, the statement was just this really moderate, like, you know, we're your sheep, you know, feed the sheep, you know, we understand, you know, God is through you, and we just want you to help us get some food. So it was this peaceful demonstration led by a priest, no weapons, nothing. It was just this peaceful gathering out in front of the Winter Palace. And the Tsar's response was to send the Cossacks, which were the mounted soldiers with their swords and their guns, and to just kill thousands of people out there in the streets in front of the Tsar's palace. And thousands of people were killed in St. Petersburg, which is where the Winter Palace was. And so in response, the workers all over the city rose up. There were massive strikes, and in the lead up to it, there had been strikes everywhere, and there were massive strikes going on, and the workers took control of the city temporarily, and they formed the first, what eventually was called a Soviet, and it was, you know, rebel members of the army and workers and unions. They formed a council of the city that was to replace the Tsarist government, and it was the Soviet, or the Council of Worker and Soldier Deputies, meaning people elected by the workers and soldiers, and they held power temporarily in the city, and Leon Trotsky was the president of the Soviet, and the revolt ultimately failed. Trotsky and all the leaders of it were put on trial and eventually exiled and sent out of the country. A lot of people were killed. So, and one of the key developments was that because there was all these, you know, this revolutionary activity going on, and the number of strikes that were going on around the country was increasing every year. It was almost like you can almost draw a graph, and it started out in the years before the revolution, and it started gradually increasing, like there were more and more strikes. There were also a number of what you call political strikes, meaning that the workers were striking not just for things that involved their own workplace, but also making political demands, like the right to vote, or the right to, you know, the right to change laws and all that were not just about we want higher wages on our job. There were these political strikes. And as they were increasing, there was a growing strife between the nobility and the Tsar, which was the old feudal rulers, and the capitalists. The capitalists were very much, they were developing an economy based on industry and all of that, whereas the Tsarist government had been based on a feudal agrarian economy. And it got to the point that the tension was growing.